It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. Now, I kind of feel like this week's movie should maybe be like, I don't know, the flagship of the entire Monster Mondays series here on Film Seizure. Today I'm going to discuss 2010's Monsters by eventual Godzilla director Gareth Edwards. Monsters was one of those movies that came out between the late aughts and the early 2010s that featured big monsters on a low budget. While I certainly didn't really care much for the most popular of these movies, Cloverfield, these types of sci-fi movies could do a whole bunch with a little bit of money and a whole lot of good ideas. Now, Edwards came up with the idea while watching a fisherman trying to bring in a big creature in a net. And I'll get to a little bit more about what he determined from that here in just a moment. But back in his days at film school, he did make a short monster movie that was set in a suburban setting. He always wanted to expand on that idea, but when Spielberg's War of the Worlds came out, he kind of lost a little bit of steam, thinking that his monster movie wouldn't be all that special anymore. He then had an idea that mixed a found footage element, but then found out that's what Cloverfield's gimmick was, so he had to abandon that as well. The next idea he had was to have something dealing with a war on the other side of the world, and no one on the side of the world the movie is set in really caring much about what's going on over there. But finally, he saw those fishermen. And what if what they pulled out of the water was a giant creature that isn't normal or part of our world, but just a giant monster? To add to that, what if it was now part of regular life coming across these giant, almost alien creatures? That was going to be the angle for his little monster movie. The movie will take place after most monster movies end. Instead of people confronting the monster and running and screaming, the monsters have already come and wreaked havoc. Now this is the new normal life. So the story of the movie is as such. 6 years ago, evidence of life within our solar system was discovered. NASA sent a probe to collect samples, but when it came back, it broke up in the atmosphere. Pieces of the craft landed in Mexico. Shortly after, these horrific creatures began appearing. The U.S. and Mexican armies fought the creatures back and have set up a large quarantine area in the northern half of Mexico, which is mostly referred to as the infected zone. The armies of the two countries fight to keep the monster at bay, and the U.S. has erected a giant wall to keep them safe. Now, the movie focuses on an American photojournalist named Andrew, and he's sent by his employer to find his employer's daughter, Samantha, and bring her back to the United States. Now, Andrew is a little cranky in general, and Samantha seemingly is hiding something. And Andrew finds her at a hospital where she's getting treated for a sprained wrist. Before getting on a train, Samantha's father asks her to call her fiance to tell him that she's okay, but she kind of ducks out of it. They then get on the train, but further down the way, the tracks are damaged, so they have to get off and keep moving. They learn from locals that if they don't get out of Mexico in the next few days, they are basically stuck there for the next 6 months. They plan to board a ferry to the U.S., but need to stay the night in a town close to where the creatures will soon be migrating. After a night of drinking and trying to have a little fun, knowing that they will be leaving the next morning, Samantha turns down romantic advances from Andrew. He ends up hooking up with a local girl. Samantha, who has a little bit of a change of heart about Andrew, discovers the girl in his bed and takes off for the dock to catch her ferry, but forgets that Andrew has her passport. When he goes to look for it, he soon realizes that last night's date has robbed him of not just his money, but also of their passports. They have to now go through the infected zone with little protection, no passports, and practically no way to solve any problems if they come up with any of the locals that they may be meeting there. Just as advertised, the infected zone is fraught with danger. They are mostly traveling by way of riverboat, and it is kind of a rickety boat and breaks down near where one of the creatures lives underwater. The next morning, they are handed off to a group of well-armed guys to guide them to the U.S. border over land. They learn that these aliens have basically infected the trees. That's what it means by the infected zone. They're shown bioluminescent fungus like mushrooms clinging to the trees that react to light and vibration. Basically, these are the eggs of the creatures. And that night, a creature is nearby and attacks and kills all of their escorts. The next morning, Andrew and Sam find that some supplies, but also some bodies of a dead family and a small girl included, that were fleeing for safety. They eventually find the border to the U.S. and the giant wall that welcomes them into the country. When they go in through the gates, they find that no one is at their post and that there's no power to anything there either. In the distance, they see jets and smoke and a sign leading them to an evacuation area. America has been attacked by one of the creatures. Andrew investigates one that seems to have been killed during the airstrikes that has leveled the small town near the border. They find an old lady stumbling through the town and speaking gibberish, and they're really not sure where they could go from there, so they decide to continue into the evacuation zone and follow the signs. There they find a gas station where they call 911 to get an army escort to pick them up. Andrew calls his son to wish him a happy birthday, and Samantha calls her fiance to let her know that she's okay. Afterwards, though, a silent creature stalks the gas station and searches through the store, feeding from the lights within the gas station. Samantha shuts off the lights to make the creature move on, but a second creature shows up to mate with the first. Samantha and Andrew watch in plain sight, but the monsters seem to pay no attention to them and just carry on after mating. The army comes, and Andrew and Samantha share a kiss before being ushered into separate vehicles, seemingly to their ultimate safety and a happily ever after. Now let's get to my 3 things I like about monsters. First, I actually like the 2 main characters in this movie. Samantha, who's played by Whitney Able, seems to be running away from responsibility, or at least expectations of what she should be doing as a young lady or as a young adult. Like she's supposed to be getting married, but she never really wants to talk about it and never really wants to call her fiance. She's a little bit of a stock character if this was something other than a low-budget character-driven monster movie. On the other side of it is Andrew, played by Scoot McNairy, who is basically an asshole. He's crass and kind of disaffected by his profession. He states at one point that Samantha's father will pay him something like $50,000 for a picture of a child who's been killed by one of the creatures. However, if he takes a picture of a happy child living life and being basically unaffected by the creatures, he doesn't get paid at all. There is a bit of a layered idea to the characters as well. How they deal with the world they are in is kind of based on their lives and what they were before the creatures came to Earth. Her privilege makes her a little less concerned. He's part of the dredges of what the new world has created. Before he worked as a photographer, and probably one that worked some bad places to begin with, and now he's kind of out to get photos of the really bad shit just to kind of survive in this world. As I said, in any other type of movie, these are kind of paper-thin characters, but in this movie, it's quite a bit different than what you'd normally see in a regular monster movie, and they're really kind of interesting, and you're with them the entire time. You're seeing everything through their perspective, and it's really interesting to see this new world from them. Now, that said, there is a wonderful scene in which they're both calling their loved ones, and you're hearing their sides of the conversation. His side is all about wanting to come home to see his son and where his loved one is, while hers is all about not really wanting to go home to her fiance and resisting the idea of rushing home to him. it's really well done to further illustrate how things are not as they seem. A girl who should be happy that she's getting married, that she's able to go and live any kind of life that she wants. And then you have a guy who's lost some of his drive for happiness because he's basically been told in the past that he won't be his own son's father. And then they feel the opposite feelings being so close from home. She doesn't want to go home when you think she should want to go home. And he wants to go home where you begin to think that maybe he would just kind of accept his place in this kid's life and just leave. Now, second, I think this movie is really well shot. It's obviously shot in like Central America and Mexico for the most part, with some in the United States as well. However, since it is shot with mostly consumer grade equipment, there appears to be a lot of natural light or low lighting in use. In addition, there's a lot of what I'd like to call natural beauty shots. In other words, they are in real towns, real places, and when they are on that boat traveling through the infected zone, there are some really great shots of the nature around them, including a wonderfully orange morning sky before they're handed over to the guys who will take them the rest of the way across land. Once on land, you have pretty lush scenery as well. Now, lastly, I really like how this movie is paced and constructed. The beginning of the movie opens with the chronological end of this movie's story, which is not exactly something you would think would play well with the overall until it does. It uses the found footage element and is a little bit more exciting and jarring than the movie actually is. That said, you need to let the rest of the movie play itself out for the payoff. It's a good slow burn that relies more on the characters to drive it than the monsters themselves. The monsters are cool and well designed, but they aren't the focus. The idea of how much life has changed without really actually seemingly to have changed that much outside the infected zone is fascinating. It's a slightly different take on the post-apocalyptic idea. The world is kind of already dead because these creatures will spread and it will be almost impossible to stop them. But the idea still lingers that once you get into the U.S., everything will be normal again and all this horror just doesn't exist anymore. And it's ultimately a pipe dream. What I find even more interesting is that this movie was not actually scripted. Edwards had a treatment and gave the actors the most important stuff they had to say, but not exactly what to say. How they say their lines or what they give is figured out on the spot. So it does incorporate a little bit of that Blair Witch Project idea that Edwards had and kind of was inspired by before finding out about Cloverfield. Still, I had zero idea it wasn't scripted until about 2/3 of the way through the movie. It feels very natural and helps you really like what these characters are dealing with. Now that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday.